My name is Margaret Wilson. I'm 67 years old, and my own daughter drained my retirement savings, stole my granddaughter's college fund, and left us with nothing but a pile of bills and a broken heart. She thought she'd gotten away with it, but she never imagined her 14-year-old daughter and an old-fashioned grandmother would be the ones to bring her entire criminal enterprise crashing down. It's a long story, but I feel like it needs to be told. I'm sitting here in my living room in Oak Ridge. It's a little past 9 in the morning. I'd love to know where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. Let me know in the comments. It makes the world feel a little smaller, doesn't it? The morning it all began was beautiful. One of those perfect late spring days in Oak Ridge where the sun warms your skin, but the air is still crisp. I was in my garden, coaxing the last of the tulips to stand tall, my hands deep in the rich soil. This house, a sturdy Victorian passed down from my parents, has always been my sanctuary. Every creaking floorboard, every pane of wavy glass tells a story. It's the home where I raised my daughter, Rachel, and now where I was raising her daughter, my granddaughter, Emily. "Grandma, breakfast is ready," Emily's voice called from the kitchen window. It was a sound as comforting as the morning birdsong. "Coming, sweetie," I said, patting the dirt from my hands. Inside, the scent of coffee and toast filled the air. Emily, my Emily, was already at the table, her nose in a book, a plate of scrambled eggs waiting for me. At 14, she had a quiet intensity about her that I'd always admired. She had her mother's dark hair, but my late husband's steady, observant eyes. Those eyes missed nothing. Our peaceful morning ritual was broken the moment Rachel came downstairs. She was a storm cloud in our sunny kitchen. At 40, my daughter carried a world of resentment on her shoulders. She barely glanced at us, grabbing the coffee pot and pouring a cup with a clatter. "Morning," I said, trying to keep my voice light. Was her only reply, her eyes already glued to her phone screen. She'd been living with us for the past 2 years, ever since she had lost another job. Each day, the distance between us seemed to grow wider, an invisible wall I didn't know how to break down. Later that afternoon, a small moment, a tiny crack in the foundation of our lives appeared. I was struggling with my laptop, trying to pay a bill online. The website was confusing, and I felt a familiar frustration building. "This blasted thing. I just can't get it to work," I muttered. Rachel walked by the living room, glancing in. "Honestly, Mom, it's not that hard. It's 2025. Maybe you should take a class." The condescension in her voice was sharp enough to cut glass. She didn't offer to help, just walked away, leaving me feeling small and incompetent. A few minutes later, Emily came over. "What's wrong, Grandma?" I sighed. "Just this bill. The website changed." She pulled up a chair. "Let me see." In less than 2 minutes, with a few clicks and a quiet confidence, she had navigated the site and paid the bill. "You just have to clear the cache sometimes," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. "Thank you, sweetie. You're a lifesaver," I said, patting her hand. At the time, I just thought she was a bright kid who was good with computers. I had no idea that her skills, honed in the quiet of her bedroom, were far beyond just clearing a browser's cache. As I watched her go back to her homework, a flicker of a memory surfaced. A memory of Rachel, years ago, when she was just a teenager. I remembered an argument we had about her friends, about her future. I'd been a single mother for most of her life after a difficult divorce, and I was terrified of her making a mistake. I'd been strict, maybe too strict. "I'm only hard on you because I love you, Rachel," I'd said. I saw then the same resentful, shuttered look on her face that she wore now as a grown woman. I'd always hoped she'd understand I was just trying to protect her, to give her the best chance. But looking back, I wondered if all she ever felt was the pressure, the judgment. Maybe the cracks in our foundation had started forming long before she ever moved back home. I pushed the thought away. A mother's guilt is a heavy thing to carry. I didn't know then that the weight was about to become unbearable. The sound that changed everything wasn't a shout or a cry. It was a thud. A heavy, final sound from upstairs. I was in the living room trying to mend a tear in one of my late husband's old armchairs when I heard it. It was the sound of a heavy suitcase being dropped onto the floor. My heart gave a little lurch. I set down my sewing kit, my fingers suddenly clumsy. "Rachel!" I called out. No answer. I climbed the stairs, each step creaking like a note of warning. Her bedroom door was open, and inside, the scene made my breath catch in my throat. 2 large suitcases were on the bed, one already closed, the other half filled with her clothes. She was moving with a cold, efficient fury, pulling things from her closet and drawers. "Rachel! What are you doing?" My voice was barely a whisper. She didn't stop what she was doing. She didn't even look at me. "What do you think I'm doing? I'm leaving." "Leaving? Leaving for where? What are you talking about?" The questions tumbled out, laced with a rising panic. Finally, she stopped and turned to face me. There was no sadness in her eyes, no conflict, only a flat, hard resolve. "I'm getting out. I should have done this years ago. I'm starting my life over with someone who actually values me." "Someone?" I stammered. "But what about us? What about Emily?" A cruel smirk touched her lips. "What about Emily? She'll be fine. You've been her real parent since day one anyway. You always wanted it that way." Each word was a deliberate jab aimed at the softest parts of my heart. She was twisting my love and sacrifice into a weapon against me. "That's not true," I said, my voice trembling. "I stepped in because her mother needed help, because I wasn't good enough, because I never lived up to the sainted memory of your perfect husband or your perfect life. I'm done, Mom. I'm done trying." The pain was so sharp it felt physical, like a hand squeezing my chest. "But where will you go? How will you live?" She laughed, a short, bitter sound. "Don't worry about me. My boyfriend Thomas, he has a plan. He's got a big promotion coming in. We'll be fine. Better than fine." She pushed past me, dragging the heavy bags toward the stairs. I just stood there frozen in the doorway of her room, the scent of her perfume already fading. "You can't just leave," I pleaded, following her down the stairs. "What about the bills, the mortgage? Your name is on some of them, Rachel. We share the responsibility." At the front door, she paused and turned. The look on her face was one I will never forget. It was pure, chilling indifference. "That sounds like your problem now," she said, her voice dropping to a cold, even tone. "Good luck with that." And then she was gone. The front door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the quiet house like a gunshot. I stood in the hallway, staring at the wood grain of the door, my entire world tilting on its axis. The silence she left behind was louder and more terrifying than any argument we'd ever had. The first few hours after Rachel left are a blur of numb disbelief. I remember sinking onto the bottom step of the staircase, the one that always creaks, and just sitting there, staring into space. The house felt huge and empty. The silence was a physical weight. Emily found me there. She didn't say much, just sat down beside me and put her small hand on my arm. Her presence was a tiny anchor in a swirling sea of shock and pain. That night, sleep was impossible. My mind raced, replaying Rachel's cruel words over and over. "That sounds like your problem now." The phrase echoed in my head, each repetition chipping away at my composure. Around 2 a.m, I gave up trying to rest. I went downstairs to the kitchen to make a cup of chamomile tea, my hands shaking so badly I spilled half the water. As I sat at the kitchen table, the reality of my situation began to dawn on me. It wasn't just the emotional devastation, it was the practical, financial nightmare Rachel had left in her wake. I was a retired teacher on a fixed pension. My husband, before he passed, had left us comfortable but not wealthy. The house was paid for, a blessing that was the bedrock of our security, an inheritance from my own parents. But the property taxes, the utilities, the insurance, I had always counted on Rachel's contribution, however sporadic it had been.
With a heavy heart, I walked into the small office off the living room and pulled out the large accordion file where I kept our finances. Bills, bank statements, tax returns, a paper trail of a life now in chaos. I had to know exactly where I stood. I had to face the monster head on. I spread the papers across the dining room table, a daunting landscape of numbers and legal jargon. For an hour, I sorted and calculated, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. It was bad, but maybe, just maybe, manageable. If I was careful, extremely careful. Then I saw it. It was on the most recent joint bank statement, the account I shared with Rachel for household expenses. Tucked between a charge for the grocery store and the electric bill was a line item that made me frown. Transfer for $250 to something called Horizon Financial Services. I didn't recognize the name. I racked my brain. It wasn't a utility. It wasn't a loan payment. Why would we be sending money to a financial services company? I flipped through the older statements. There it was again, last month, for the same amount. And the month before that. Small, regular payments, just small enough to fly under the radar. My heart started to beat a little faster. This felt warm. It felt secretive. On a hunch, I logged onto my laptop, my fingers fumbling on the keys. I went to the bank's website, my eyes scanning the detailed transaction history. And that's when the first wave of cold fear washed over me. It wasn't just the $250 payments. There were others. Larger withdrawals. One for $1,000 2 weeks ago. Another for $1,500 a month before that. All made online, all authorized from an IP address I didn't recognize. "No," I whispered to the empty room. "No, she wouldn't." But I knew she would. I knew she had. Just then, a floorboard creaked upstairs. A few moments later, Emily appeared in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted against the hall light. She was wearing her robe, her eyes wide with concern. "Grandma, what are you doing? It's almost 4 a.m. I couldn't hide the tremor in my voice. "Emily, come look at this." She came and stood behind me, her eyes scanning the screen. I pointed a shaking finger at the withdrawals. "I didn't make these transfers, sweetie. I don't even know who Horizon Financial Services is." Emily was silent for a long moment, her expression unreadable. She leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. She wasn't shocked or surprised. She looked focused. "I know who they are, Grandma," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Let me look at something." She gently moved me aside and sat down at the laptop. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with a speed and precision that stunned me. She wasn't just typing. She was navigating a world I didn't understand. She pulled up windows filled with code, her eyes darting back and forth. This wasn't just a kid who was good with computers. This was something else entirely. And as I watched her, the first fragile thread of a terrible truth began to unspeel in the pre-dawn stillness of my home. The small, strange charge on our bank statement wasn't just a clue. It was the beginning of a nightmare far deeper than I could ever have imagined. The next few hours passed in a surreal haze. The dining room, usually a place of family meals and laughter, became a war room. The only sounds were the soft clicking of the keyboard and my own ragged breathing. Emily was in a state of deep concentration, her face illuminated by the glow of the laptop screen. She wasn't my 14-year-old grandma anymore. She was a detective, a cyber sleuth navigating a dark and murky digital world. "Okay," she said finally, her voice pulling me from my daze. "I'm in." "In?" I asked, my voice hoarse. "In where?" She said, "The transaction logs. I'm bypassing the bank's front-end user interface and looking at the raw data. The transfers weren't just sent to Horizon. They were authorized using a specific employee portal login." She pointed to a string of characters on the screen. "This login, it's assigned to an employee." A cold dread settled deep in my bones. An employee? Who? Emily's fingers moved again, a flurry of activity. A few seconds later, a name appeared on the screen. Thomas K. Kramer. The name Rachel had mentioned. My boyfriend, Thomas, he has a plan. The words echoed in my memory, now dripping with a sinister new meaning. It's him, I whispered. The employee. It gets worse, Grandma, Emily said, her voice grim. She clicked a few more times and a new window popped up. It was a social media profile page. A handsome, smirking man in an expensive suit stared back at us. Thomas K. Kramer. His profile was public, a curated gallery of a life of luxury. Pictures on a boat, in front of a sports car, at fancy restaurants where a single meal would cost more than my weekly grocery budget. My stomach churned. This was where our money was going, to fund this lie. I scrolled through the pictures, my heart sinking lower with each click. And then I saw her. Rachel. She was in a photo from 3 weeks ago, arm in arm with Thomas on a beach somewhere tropical. She was laughing, looking happier and more carefree than I had seen her in years. The caption read, "Celebrating my man's latest success. Big things come."
The hypocrisy was a physical blow. While she was living this fantasy, she was systematically draining the accounts that were supposed to secure my old age and provide for her own daughter's future. His profile says he's a senior wealth manager at Horizon, Emily read aloud, her voice tight with anger, specializing in retirement security and estate planning. The irony was so bitter, I felt like I was going to be sick. A man who supposedly helped people with their retirement was stealing mine. "There's more," Emily said, her tone shifting. She had found a link to a local news article from a year ago. It was a small piece, a business announcement. Horizon Financial Services welcomes Thomas Kramer to its team. It included a standard corporate biography. It mentioned his previous work history, his supposed expertise. But one sentence jumped out at me. It mentioned he was a single father who had recently won full custody of his son after a contentious legal battle. The keyword custody hung in the air, a testament to his ability to manipulate systems for his own gain. "He's a professional," I breathed, the full weight of the situation crashing down on me. "This isn't just a greedy boyfriend, Emily. This man is a predator. And my daughter, my own flesh and blood, was his accomplice." Emily was quiet, but I could see the tension in her small shoulders. I reached out and put my hand over hers. Her fingers were ice cold. How are you doing all this, sweetie?" I asked, my voice filled with awe and a little bit of fear. She finally looked away from the screen, her dark eyes meeting mine. "I've been worried about Mom for a long time," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. Her moods, the way she was always so secretive with her computer. I started watching online tutorials a couple of years ago, cybersecurity, ethical hacking. I just wanted to know what was going on. I wanted to be able to protect us if I had to. My little girl, my quiet, book-loving granddaughter, had been secretly training herself to be a digital guardian. She had seen the storm coming long before I had even felt the first drop of rain. I found out she was talking to him about 6 months ago. I saw their messages. They were talking about our finances, about your pension, my college fund. She trailed off, her voice thick with emotion. I pulled her into a hug, her small frame trembling against mine. The college fund. We hadn't even checked it yet. It was a separate account started by my late husband before he died. It was his legacy for his first grandchild. The thought of them touching that sacred money was a desecration. "Check it, Emily," I said, my voice hard as steel. "Check the college fund. We need to know everything." She nodded, wiping a tear from her eye. She turned back to the laptop, her expression no longer that of a scared child, but a soldier preparing for battle. In the deep, silent hours of that terrible night, a new resolve began to burn within me. The shock was turning into anger. The pain was forging itself into a weapon. They had picked a fight with the wrong grandmother. With a few keystrokes, Emily pulled up the statement for her college fund. My breath hitched. The balance, which should have been a little over $43,000, was now a paltry
$257. They had drained nearly all of it. A series of large, systematic withdrawals over the last 4 months, all funneled through this same Horizon financial portal. Seeing that number in black and white was like a physical punch to the gut. That money wasn't just money. It was my husband's last gift. It was Emily's future, her chance to go to any university she wanted without being buried in debt. It was the one thing I thought was untouchable, a sacred trust. And Rachel, she had let him plunder it. "They took it all," I whispered, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. She let him take it all. For a moment, I felt the despair threaten to swallow me whole. We were facing a professional con artist and his willing accomplice. What could a retired teacher and a 14-year-old girl do? We were outmatched, outmaneuvered. The thought of hiring a lawyer, of a long and expensive legal battle we couldn't afford, was overwhelming. Emily must have seen the hopelessness on my face. "Don't give up, Grandma," she said, her voice fierce. "We have his name. We have the transaction records. That's more than nothing." She was right. Despair was a luxury we couldn't afford. I took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the image of Rachel's laughing face on that tropical beach from my mind and replacing it with the determined gaze of my granddaughter. "You're right," I said, my voice stronger now. "We don't give up." Emily turned back to the screen. "I'm going to keep digging. There has to be more." She navigated back to the search results for Thomas Kramer, her eyes scanning for anything we might have missed. And that's when she found it. It wasn't a news article or a social media profile. It was a link to an obscure online forum, a message board for victims of financial fraud. The thread was titled, "Anyone else dealt with Horizon Financial Services?" My heart leaped. We weren't the only ones. We read through the posts a series of heartbreaking stories from people, mostly seniors, who had lost their savings. They spoke of a charming advisor who promised them incredible returns, who gained their trust and then bled their accounts dry. Several of them mentioned the same man, Thomas Kramer, but their stories were filled with frustration. They had complained to the company, to the authorities, but with little success. It was always a case of he said, she said. Thomas had covered his tracks with complex paperwork they'd signed, but hadn't fully understood. They had no concrete proof of criminal intent. "They need what we have," Emily said, her eyes gleaming with a sudden realization. "They have the stories, but we have the digital trail. We can prove he used an employee portal to make unauthorized transfers." I scrolled through the names of the posters. Most were anonymous usernames, but one post caught my eye. It was signed by H. Harrison. My blood ran cold. "Harry Harrison?" I said aloud. It can't be. Harry had been a history teacher at the same school as me for over 20 years. A kind, decent man who had retired a few years before I did. I remember talking to him at a colleague's funeral last year. He'd been so excited about his plans to travel with his wife. "You know him, Grandma?" "I do," I said, my mind racing. This changed everything. This wasn't an abstract crime against strangers anymore. This was personal. Thomas hadn't just stolen from me. He had stolen from my friend, my colleague. A bold, terrifying idea began to form in my mind. It was a long shot. It was intrusive, and it was awkward. But it was the only move I could think of. "Emily, find me his phone number," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to call him," I said, the decision solidifying as I spoke the words. Emily looked at me, her eyes wide. I could see the hesitation, the fear, but I could also see a glimmer of respect. I was no longer just the grandmother who needed her help with the computer. I was taking charge.
She found the number in an online directory. For a long moment, I just stared at the digits on the screen, my heart pounding against my ribs. What if he hung up on me? What if he thought I was crazy? I took a deep breath. I thought of Emily's stolen college fund. I thought of Harry's travel plans, likely now just a shattered dream. I picked up my phone. My hand was trembling as I dialed. It rang 3 times, each ring echoing the frantic beat of my heart. Hello? A man's voice, tired and wary. Harry? I began, my voice unsteady. Harry Harrison? It's Margaret Wilson. We used to teach together at Northwood High. There was a pause. Margaret? My goodness, it's been a while. Is everything all right? It's awfully early. No, Harry, I said, my voice low and urgent. Everything is not all right. The reason I'm calling, it's about a man named Thomas Kramer and a company called Horizon Financial Services. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was a silence heavy with shared pain and a dawning, terrible understanding. In that moment, our small 2-person investigation became something more. It became an alliance. The phone call with Harry Harrison lasted for over an hour. At first, he was cautious, his voice tight with the shame and frustration that so many victims of these scams feel. But as I explained what Emily and I had uncovered, the digital backdoors, the proof of unauthorized transfers linked directly to Thomas's employee login, I could hear the change in his tone. The wariness was replaced by a slow-burning anger and then a spark of hope. He told me I was a fool, Harry said, his voice cracking. When I confronted him, he pulled out a mountain of paperwork I'd signed. He said I'd authorized everything, that I was just confused. He made me feel like I was losing my mind. You're not a fool, Harry, I said firmly. You are manipulated by a professional predator, and we have the proof. By the end of the call, we had a plan. Harry had kept meticulous records of every conversation, every promise Thomas had made. He agreed to send me scanned copies of everything. He also had the contact information for 2 other victims who had confided in him. Our single thread of evidence was beginning to weave itself into a rope. After I hung up, I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion and exhilaration. For the first time since Rachel slammed the door shut, I felt a flicker of power. We weren't just victims anymore. We were fighting back. I immediately called my best friend, Eleanor. Eleanor and I had been friends for over 40 years, since we were rookie teachers sharing a classroom. She was pragmatic, sharp as a tack, and fiercely loyal. I told her everything, my voice breaking, as I recounted the depth of Rachel's betrayal. She listened patiently, her silence a comforting presence on the other end of the line. When she finished, she didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. She just said, "That worthless snake. What do you need me to do?" That was Eleanor, always ready for a fight. "I don't know," I admitted. "I feel like we're in over our heads." "Nonsense," she scoffed. "You have a tech genius and you have the truth. What you need now is more information. Let me make a few calls. The retired teacher network is more powerful than the CIA. Someone knows something about this Thomas Kramer character." And so our team was formed. For the next 3 days, my quiet Victorian house became a bustling headquarters for our covert operation. I was the commander, the strategist, poring over the documents Harry sent, highlighting inconsistencies, and creating a timeline of Thomas's crimes. Emily was my technical operations chief. She took the information from Harry and the other victims and cross-referenced it with the digital evidence she was still pulling from Horizon's leaky servers. She worked tirelessly, her face a mask of concentration, driven by a fierce love for me and a cold fury for the mother who had abandoned her. I saw the toll it was taking on her. There were dark circles under her eyes. One afternoon, I came into the dining room and found her with her head in her hands, just staring at the screen. "What is it, sweetie?" I asked gently. "It's just so much, Grandma," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She found the messages between Mom and him. She gave him the password to my college fund account. She joked about it. She called it our little celery bonus." The callousness of it stole my breath. I knelt by her chair and wrapped my arms around her. "I am so sorry, Emily," I said, my own tears welling up. "I am so sorry I didn't protect you from her." She turned and buried her face in my shoulder. "It's not your fault," she sobbed. "You've always protected me." We stayed like that for a long time.
2 generations of women holding each other together against the storm my own daughter had unleashed. Her moment of vulnerability reminded me that beneath the tough exterior, she was still a child, forced to carry a burden no child should ever have to bear. It hardened my resolve even further. Meanwhile, Eleanor was our intelligence agent. She made discreet calls to old friends and colleagues. She found someone whose niece had briefly worked at Horizon. The niece quit because she was uncomfortable with Thomas Kramer's methods. She described him as a shark in a $1,000 suit who specifically targeted older, vulnerable clients, especially recent widows and widowers who had just come into an inheritance. He preyed on them right after a funeral, when their grief made them easy targets. The pieces were all slotting into place. We weren't just dealing with theft. We were dealing with a systematic campaign of elder abuse. On the 3rd day, Emily finished her work. She had compiled everything into a single encrypted digital file. It was a masterpiece of evidence. It contained a complete log of every unauthorized transaction from my accounts and the accounts of the other 5 victims who had agreed to join us, the corresponding internal server data from Horizon proving the transactions were initiated by Thomas's employee login, scanned copies of the misleading documents Thomas had his victims sign, transcripts of the chat logs between Rachel and Thomas where they openly discussed their scheme, the stolen college fund, and their plans to disappear. A detailed 10-page summary written by me outlining the entire criminal conspiracy in clear, simple language. We had it. We had the smoking gun, the cannon, the entire arsenal. Now we just had to fire it. The moment of truth arrived on a gray, overcast Thursday afternoon. The 3 of us, me, Emily, and Eleanor, who had come over to offer moral support, were gathered around the dining room table. It was covered in our work, printouts, notebooks, and at the center of it all, my laptop, displaying the final, polished evidence package. "It's ready," Emily said, her voice quiet but steady. A heavy silence settled over the room. For 3 days, we had been running on adrenaline and anger. But now, faced with the finality of this moment, a wave of apprehension washed over me. This was the point of no return. Once we sent this file, we would unleash a storm, and we had no idea where the pieces would land.
"Are we sure about this?" I asked, looking from Emily's determined face to Eleanor's steady gaze. "What if they retaliate? What if they try to hurt us?" Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand on mine. Her grip was firm. "Margaret," she said, her voice leaving no room for doubt, "what they've already done is worse than anything they could possibly do now. They didn't just steal your money. They stole your peace of mind. They stole Emily's security. You are not the one who should be afraid. They are." She was right. Fear was their weapon, and I refused to let them use it against us any longer. I looked at Emily. "What do you think, sweetie?" She nodded, her eyes fixed on the screen. "He's a predator, Grandma. And Mom, she's helping him. They're probably already targeting someone new. We have to stop them." Her maturity, her clarity of purpose, filled me with a fierce pride that eclipsed my fear. My granddaughter was a warrior. It was time I acted like one, too. "All right," I said, taking a deep breath. "Let's do it." Our plan was a 3-prong attack, designed to hit them from all sides at once, leaving them no room to run or hide. First, Emily opened a new anonymous email account. She attached the encrypted file and addressed the email to one Mr. David Chen. Through her research, Emily had identified him not just as the CEO of Horizon Financial Services, but as a man who had a reputation for being ruthless when it came to protecting his firm's integrity. The subject line was simple and chilling. "Evidence of systemic fraud within your company. Thomas Kramer." With a steady hand, Emily clicked send. The first missile was launched. Next, she navigated to the official online portal for the state's Financial Crimes Unit. She filled out the detailed report, attaching the same evidence file. She was careful to frame it as a submission from a concerned third party, protecting our identities for now. Click. The second missile was on its way.
Finally, she opened the fraud reporting portals for our banks. One by one, she filed official disputes for every single unauthorized transaction, again attaching the digital proof that they were part of a criminal scheme. Click, click, click. The file attack was underway. When the last report was sent, Emily closed the laptop. The silence in the room was deafening. It was done. The trap was set. All we could do now was wait for the jaws to spring shut. We spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous anticipation. Every time the phone rang, my heart leapt into my throat. We drank countless cups of tea. Eleanor tried to distract us with stories from her new gardening club, but we were all just watching the clock. The first sign came the next morning. It was an email from my bank. Fraud alert update. We have received your documentation and have placed a temporary freeze on the accounts in question pending a full investigation. A fraud investigator will be in contact with you shortly. A small victory. A ripple in the water. Then, late that afternoon, the big one came. It wasn't an email or a phone call. It was a news alert on Eleanor's phone, which she had set for any mention of Horizon Financial Services. She gasped, holding up the screen for us to see. It was a short press release from a financial newswire. Horizon Financial Services announced today that it has suspended Senior Wealth Manager Thomas Kramer pending an internal investigation into allegations of gross professional misconduct. The company has stated it is cooperating fully with law enforcement authorities. I read the words 3 times, letting them sink in. Suspended, cooperating with law enforcement authorities. It was happening. The storm we had unleashed was making landfall. Eleanor let out a whoop of triumph. Emily allowed herself a small, weary smile. I just sat there, a wave of profound relief washing over me, so potent it almost brought me to my knees. He was stopped. They were stopped. But I knew it wasn't over. We had taken down the shark. Now we had to deal with the person who had let him into our home. Now we had to wait for the call from my daughter. The call came on Saturday morning. The sky had cleared and the sun was streaming through the windows, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in our lives. I was trying to read a book in the living room, but I'd been staring at the same page for 10 minutes. Emily was upstairs, finally catching up on some needed sleep. The house was quiet. Then the phone rang, its shrill sound cutting through the stillness. I looked at the caller ID. Rachel. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The confrontation I had been dreading and, in a strange way, preparing for all my life. I let it ring 3 times, gathering myself. I took a deep breath, picturing Emily's tired face, Harry Harrison's cracking voice, and the stolen $43,000 from the college fund. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I was not the victim here. Not anymore. I answered the call and put it on speakerphone. Hello, Rachel. Mom, what is going on? What did you do? I kept my voice calm, level, and cool. It was a tone I hadn't used since my early days of teaching, the one reserved for a student who had crossed a serious line. I'm not sure what you mean, Rachel. You're the one who left. I assumed you were off living your wonderful new life. Don't play dumb with me, she screamed. Our accounts are frozen, all of them. Thomas was suspended yesterday. They're accusing him of fraud. This has your fingerprints all over it. Our accounts. The word dripped with entitlement that made my blood run cold. This was my moment. This was the final move in the chess game, and I was not just a pawn. I was the queen. Fraud, you say, I began, letting the words hang in the air. That's a very serious accusation. Is that what Thomas has been doing, committing fraud? Of course not, she sputtered, but the frantic edge in her voice betrayed her lie. It's a misunderstanding. Someone is framing him. Someone or someone's? I countered, my voice dangerously soft.
It's funny you should call. I had a very interesting conversation with an old colleague of mine the other day. Harry Harrison, do you remember him? A lovely man. He seemed to be having some issues with Mr. Kramer's services as well. There was a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Silence. I had hit a nerve. She hadn't expected me to know about the others. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, her voice losing its bluster. Don't you, Rachel? And what about Emily's college fund? The one my husband, your father, worked so hard to set up. Was draining that also a misunderstanding? Or was that what you and Thomas called your little salary bonus? The silence that followed was deafening. I had repeated the exact words from their private messages. In that moment, she knew. She knew that we had everything. The shock in her silence was more satisfying than any screaming match could ever be.
When she finally spoke, her voice was a venomous whisper. "You've been spying on me. You and that brat. You went through my things." "I mistake you for a fool, Rachel," I said, my voice like ice. "But your greatest mistake was forgetting who Emily is. You saw a quiet girl you could abandon. I see a brilliant young woman who loves her grandmother. You saw a computer as your tool for theft. She saw it as her shield to protect her family. You thought you were a predator, but you are living in the same house as a dragon, and dragons protect their own." I could hear her ragged, panicked breathing, the cornered animal realizing the trap was inescapable. "You ruined everything," she finally sobbed, the anger collapsing into pathetic self-pity. "My life was finally going to be perfect. He was going to get a huge promotion. We were going to be rich." Rich on the life savings of retirees? Rich on the future of your own child? That's not a life, Rachel. That's a parasite's existence. You talk about your father. If he were alive today, he would be so deeply, utterly ashamed of the person you've become. Mentioning her father was the final blow. I heard a sound like a wounded animal, a cry of pure despair. And as she was crying, as her world was crumbling around her through a phone line, I heard another sound in the background, a loud, authoritative knock. Knock, knock, knock. "What was that?" I asked, my voice devoid of all emotion. "I don't know," she whimpered. Then I heard a man's voice, muffled but clear. "Rachel Peters, open up. Police." The phone line was filled with a sudden chaotic scramble of sounds, a yelp of terror from Rachel, the sound of a door being forced open. "Ma'am, you are under arrest." The last thing I heard before the line went dead was my daughter's final, horrified scream. I slowly lowered the phone and placed it back in its cradle. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the bright, sunlit street. It was over. The gambit was complete. Checkmate. The silence that filled the house after the call ended was absolute. It was a heavy, profound quiet, the kind that follows a massive explosion. The battle was over. The war was won. I stood by the window for a long time, just breathing, in and out. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the release of so much tension, so much anger held for so long. A soft footstep on the stairs made me turn. Emily was standing there, her face pale, her eyes wide. She had clearly been woken by Rachel's shouting and had heard everything. She didn't say a word. She just came to me and wrapped her arms around my waist, burying her face in my side. I held her tightly, stroking her hair. We stood there together, two survivors on a quiet shore. The wreckage of our family finally settled around us. There were no cheers, no shouts of victory, just a deep, shared, and sorrowful relief. We had not sought this fight, but we had finished it. Later that day, we got a call from a Detective Miller. He was the lead investigator on the case. His voice was professional and respectful. He confirmed that both Rachel and Thomas Kramer had been taken into custody. The evidence package you provided was comprehensive, Mrs. Wilson, he said, a note of understatement in his voice. It's the most buttoned-up case of financial fraud I've seen in my 10 years on the force. You and your granddaughter have done a great service, not just for yourselves, but for at least 17 other victims. He explained what would happen next. There would be legal proceedings, a trial. He asked if we would be willing to give official statements. Of course, detective, I said, my voice clear and steady. We'll do whatever is needed. He also described the scene at the time of the arrest. Rachel had been completely stunned, as if she couldn't comprehend what was happening. When they presented her with the evidence in the interrogation room, the printouts of her own messages, the list of victims, the clear trail of stolen money, she had simply collapsed. The arrogant, cruel woman who had left my home without a backward glance had crumbled into a sobbing, incoherent mess. She had realized too late that she had been outmaneuvered, not by a faceless corporation or a team of high-powered lawyers, but by the mother she disdained and the daughter she had abandoned. Her underestimation of us was her ultimate downfall. Thomas, the detective said, was a different story. The slick, professional con artist immediately clammed up and demanded a lawyer. But it didn't matter. The digital evidence was irrefutable. His career as a predator was over. That night, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I slept. It was a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that only comes when a great weight has finally been lifted from your soul. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It wasn't the empty, fearful silence of abandonment. It was the calm, peaceful silence of a sanctuary reclaimed. It was the sound of safety. It was the sound of home. The 6 months that followed were a strange mixture of legal formalities and quiet healing. The trial was swift. With the overwhelming evidence we had provided, Thomas and Rachel had no real defense. Thomas, ever the manipulator, tried to pin all the blame on Rachel, claiming she was the mastermind. Rachel, in turn, painted herself as a victim, a woman blinded by love and coerced by a dominant man. But the text messages, the ones where they joked about the stolen funds and planned their luxurious future, told the true story. They were partners. The jury saw it clearly. The verdict came in on a crisp autumn afternoon. Thomas Kramer was sentenced to 10 years in federal prison for fraud and identity theft. Rachel was sentenced to 5. The judge, a stern-looking woman with kind eyes, looked directly at Rachel as she handed down the sentence. She said, "You didn't just break the law. You broke the most sacred trust that exists, that of a child for a parent and a parent for a child. That is a crime for which no court can offer a sufficient punishment." I wasn't in the courtroom. I didn't need to be. Detective Miller called me with the news. I thanked him, hung up the phone, and went out to my garden, where the last of the autumn roses were still stubbornly blooming. I felt a sense of justice, a profound relief, but not joy. How could I feel joy at the ruin of my own daughter? It was a wound that would likely never fully heal, a scar I would carry forever. A few weeks later, a long, official-looking envelope arrived in the mail. It was from the court's restitution fund. Inside was a check made out to me and Emily for $18,400. It was the first payment from the liquidation of Thomas Kramer's seized assets. It was a fraction of what they had stolen, but it wasn't about the money. It was a symbol. It was tangible proof that we had won. I showed it to Emily. She looked at it for a long moment, then looked up at me. She said, "We should put this back in the college fund," simply.
And we did. It was the first deposit in the slow, arduous process of rebuilding her future. Eleanor came over that evening to celebrate. She brought a bottle of champagne, but we ended up drinking tea instead. "I'm proud of you, Margaret," she said, squeezing my hand. "You faced the monster, and you won." We won. I corrected her, glancing towards the living room where Emily was doing her homework. I couldn't have done it without her. Or without you. Still, Eleanor said, her eyes serious. What Rachel did, it's a wound. How are you, really? I considered her question. I'm sad, I admitted. I'm sad for the daughter I thought I had. I'm mourning a person who, I now realize, may never have truly existed. But, I added, my voice growing stronger, I'm also at peace. I know I did everything I could. I loved her, I supported her, and when she became a danger to this family, I stopped her. A mother's love has to include tough boundaries. It has to include protecting the innocent. I did that, and I am not ashamed. I realized in that moment that I had finally let go of the guilt. My responsibility to Rachel had ended where my responsibility to protect Emily began. The scars of the battle were real, but they were scars of survival, not of defeat. They were a reminder that even after the most devastating fire, new life could and would grow in the ashes. The winter that year felt different. The house was warm and peaceful. The specter of Rachel's angry presence was gone, replaced by a quiet, productive hum. The ordeal had changed us, but not in the ways our enemies might have hoped. It hadn't broken us. It had forged us. It had changed Emily most of all. The quiet, observant girl was still there, but she now carried herself with a new confidence. The skills she had been forced to learn in secret had become a source of strength and purpose. She had seen firsthand how vulnerable people could be, especially seniors, in a world that was moving online faster than they could keep up. One evening, she came to me with an idea. "Grandma," she said, her laptop open, "I was thinking, what if we could help other people? What if we could use what we learned so this doesn't happen to someone else's grandmother?" On the screen was a simple web page she had designed. At the top, in clean, bold letters, it said, "Grandma's Guardian." My heart swelled with pride. Her idea was to create a free online resource, a blog, and a series of simple video tutorials to teach seniors the basics of cybersecurity. How to spot a phishing email, how to create strong passwords, how to recognize the red flags of an online scam. "It's a wonderful idea, Emily," I told her, my voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely wonderful." And so, a new project was born in our little Victorian house. It became our shared mission. I would write the content, drawing on my decades of experience as a teacher to break down complex topics into simple, easy-to-understand lessons. Emily would handle all the technical aspects, building the website, editing the videos, making sure everything was secure and user-friendly. Our dining room table, once a war room for our fight against Rachel, was transformed again. This time, it was a production studio. We spent our weekends filming short videos, with me as the on-screen host. I was nervous at first, but Emily was a patient director. She'd advise, "Just talk to them like you're talking to Eleanor." And so I did. I spoke directly to the camera, to the thousands of other Margarets and Harrys out there. I shared our story, without the personal details, of course, and offered simple, practical advice. To our amazement, it took off. The blog posts were shared in community groups. The videos got thousands of views. We started getting emails from people all over the country. "Thank you, I just changed all my passwords. Your video helped me realize a romance I was in actually was a scam. God bless you for doing this." Emily had turned our trauma into a tool for good. She had created a legacy of resilience. She was no longer just a victim of her mother's crime. She was a protector for a whole community of elders. She was finding her own path, not just to a good college, but to a meaningful life. She was using her brilliant mind not for vengeance, but for service. Watching her, I knew that no matter what Rachel tried to destroy, she had failed. She couldn't touch the most important things: our love for each other, our integrity, our capacity to create good in the world. The inheritance that truly mattered wasn't the money in the bank or the deed to the house. It was the strength of character and the love that was now blooming in this new, peaceful chapter of our lives. One Tuesday afternoon, about a year after the trial, I was in the kitchen, humming along to the radio and kneading dough for a loaf of bread. Emily was at a school robotics club meeting. The house was filled with the scent of yeast and the warmth of the afternoon sun. It was a perfectly ordinary, perfectly peaceful day. Then, the phone rang. I wiped the flour from my hands and answered, expecting it to be Eleanor confirming our plans for a movie night. Hello? This is a collect call from an inmate at the Oakwood State Correctional Facility. Do you accept the charges?
The robotic voice repeated its question. Do you accept the charges? What was there to say? What could she possibly want? An apology? Forgiveness? Money for her prison commissary? I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that any conversation with her would be a crack in the new foundation I had so carefully built. It would be an invitation for the chaos to seep back in. I thought about my own journey. I had learned that love doesn't mean endless, destructive tolerance. It doesn't mean setting yourself on fire to keep someone else warm, especially when they are the ones holding the match. I had learned that the most powerful act of love, for myself and for Emily, was the power to say no, the power to protect our sanctuary. Some bridges, once burned, are not meant to be rebuilt. They are meant to serve as a warning, a reminder of the chasm you were brave enough to cross and leave behind. I looked out the kitchen window at my garden, at the sturdy, resilient rose bushes that came back year after year, no matter how harsh the winter. I had survived my winter. It was spring now. With a calm, steady hand, I pressed the button on the phone, ending the call. I didn't slam it down in anger. I simply disconnected. A great sense of calm washed over me. It was the final closing of a door, not with a slam, but with a quiet, decisive click. I had chosen my future. I had chosen peace. I had chosen Emily. I turned back to my bread dough, my hands moving with purpose again. As I worked, I thought about the lessons this painful journey had taught me. Our value isn't measured by how much we sacrifice or how much we endure. It's measured by our resilience. It's measured by our wisdom to know when to fight and our courage to know when to walk away. It's measured by the love we nurture, not the poison we tolerate. Thank you for listening to my story. It wasn't easy to tell, but I hope it might offer a little bit of strength to anyone out there who has ever felt taken for granted, betrayed, or invisible. Has anything like this ever touched your life? Have you ever had to make a difficult choice to protect your own peace? I would be honored to read your thoughts in the comments below. Take care of yourselves.